When people think of the Crimean War, certain images instantly come to mind. The bloody battlefields of Alma and Inkerman, the dramatic standoff at Balaclava, and of course, the legendary Charge of the Light Brigade. These are the stories that have been told and retold for generations, but hidden away on the other side of the world, far from the Crimean Peninsula, another battle was fought, one most people have never even heard of. It didn't take place in the warm waters of the Black Sea, but in the freezing, volcanic wilderness of Siberia's Pacific coast. Here, the British and French fleets launched a bold strike against a remote Russian stronghold. But before the first cannon even fired, their admiral was found dead in his cabin from a single gunshot. Accident, suicide, or something more mysterious? What followed was chaos, confusion, and a humiliating defeat at the hands of a much smaller Russian force. Tonight, we dive deep into this forgotten chapter of the Crimean War, the Battle of Petropavlovsk. Welcome to Better Sleep History, where we uncover the strange, hidden, and untold stories that the textbooks leave behind. So, where exactly is Petropavlovsk? It lies in one of the most remote corners of the world, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Imagine over 100,000 square miles of untouched wilderness, scattered with 160 volcanoes, nearly 30 of them still active, their peaks often smoking against the icy winds. It is a land of fire and ice, one of the last places you would expect a major naval clash between the world's great empires. Yet, in 1854, that's exactly what happened. The settlement itself was barely over a century old. It had been founded by Vitus Bering, the Danish explorer in Russian service, the same man the Bering Strait is named after. He named the town after his ships, St. Peter and St. Paul, and thus it became Petropavlovsk. For Russia, it was invaluable, a natural, sheltered harbor, perfectly placed as their primary naval base in the Pacific. Vladivostok, the port most associated with Russia's Far East today, wasn't even part of the empire yet. It would only become Russian in 1860. At the time, Petropavlovsk was their lifeline. To the British and French, however, it wasn't just some frozen outpost, it was a threat. The Royal Navy cared deeply about securing global trade routes to China, Southeast Asia, and the rapidly developing colonies in Australia. Any Russian base capable of sending ships against their merchant fleets was a danger, no matter how distant. And so, Petropavlovsk, small as it was, became a target. Commanding the Allied fleet was Admiral David Price, a seasoned veteran whose career stretched all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. On paper, the force he led looked unstoppable. Powerful frigates bristling with guns, hundreds of sailors and marines, and even the latest innovation, a steam-powered warship. Against them, the Russians had only 3 ships, one of which was barely seaworthy. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with ingenuity. The defenders transformed the rugged geography into a fortress. They positioned their batteries on narrow spits of land, turned peninsulas into strong points, and even stripped the guns from their ships to reinforce their land defenses. And then came the twist that turned everything upside down. On August 28, 1854, just as the Allies prepared for battle, Admiral Price withdrew to his cabin. Moments later, the sound of a gunshot rang out. He was dead. The exact cause was never determined. Some whispered of suicide, others believed it was a tragic accident, but the truth has been lost to history. What is certain is that the Allied fleet had just lost its British commander before the first shot was fired. Morale plummeted. An army without leadership is already half defeated. Still, the attack went ahead. The Allied ships opened fire, pounding the Russian positions with heavy cannon. But the defenders gave as good as they got. Both sides took damage, but the Russian fortifications held. Frustrated, the Allies tried another tactic. They would land troops and take the defenses by storm. It was a bold plan, but one that collapsed almost immediately. British Marines and French sailors scrambled ashore, advancing up the ridge above the town. The ground was treacherous, the slopes steep, and visibility clouded with smoke. Waiting for them were Cossack sharpshooters and well-placed artillery. Within minutes, many of the Allied officers lay dead or wounded, throwing the landing force into confusion. And then came the nightmare moment. French troops, lost in the chaos of smoke and shouting, opened fire on their British allies. Friendly fire turned the already desperate fight into utter disaster. Soldiers who were supposed to be brothers in arms were suddenly cutting each other down in the middle of enemy fire. As reinforcements rushed in for the Russians, panic spread through the Allied ranks. The retreat quickly became a rout. In their scramble back to the ships, discipline collapsed, and to make matters worse, the Royal Marines lost one of their most sacred symbols, the regimental colors. Their flag was swept into the sea and later recovered by the Russians, who proudly displayed it as a trophy of victory. The casualty numbers told the grim story. The Allies suffered nearly 200 dead or wounded, while Russian losses were less than half. For Britain and France, it was a humiliation. For Russia, it was one of the few victories in an otherwise brutal war. When the Allies returned the following year, determined to take Petropavlovsk once and for all, they found nothing. The Russians had abandoned the town, leaving behind only empty fortifications. They had taken their rare triumph and moved on, content to let the victory stand forever in their favor. Meanwhile, the eyes of Europe were fixed firmly on the main theater of the war, the Crimean Peninsula itself. The siege of Sevastopol, the bloody charges, the great cavalry disasters, these overshadowed everything, and so the strange, humiliating defeat at Petropavlovsk slipped into obscurity, remembered only in fragments of naval history. And that was the Battle of Petropavlovsk, an episode filled with mystery, tragedy, and disaster. A British admiral dead under strange circumstances, allies turning their guns on each other in the heat of battle, and a small, isolated Russian garrison claiming one of the few victories against Britain and France in the entire Crimean War. For the Russians, this unlikely triumph became a proud symbol of resistance. For the British and French, it was a failure they were eager to forget. But here at Bed Asleep History, we remember these forgotten stories, the strange corners of the past where human drama, mystery, and fate collide. If you enjoyed this tale, stay with us because there are countless more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, good night and sleep well with history.